Marcus Williams walked through the busy streets of Neo-Seoul, looking up at the tall buildings that seemed to touch the clouds. The year was 2045, and the city was different from his home in Chicago. Flying cars moved between buildings and robots cleaned the streets. Marcus was 16 years old and had been in Korea for only 2 months as an exchange student. The morning air was cool, and Marcus adjusted his school uniform as he walked to his bus stop. He had woken up early to finish his homework at the library. His grandmother back in Chicago always told him that education was the key to a better future. He smiled, thinking about her daily video calls where she would ask if he was eating enough and studying hard. As he waited at the crosswalk, Marcus heard a strange noise. It was like a machine making wrong sounds. He turned and saw an elderly Korean woman in a hover wheelchair. The wheelchair was moving strangely, going left and right without control. The woman looked scared, trying to press buttons on her chair's control panel, but nothing worked. Marcus's eyes went wide as he saw the wheelchair moving toward the street. The traffic light had just turned green, and cars were starting to move. Without thinking, Marcus ran toward the woman. He could hear people gasping and shouting around him. "Hold on," he shouted, reaching the wheelchair just as it was about to enter the road. He grabbed the back of the chair and pulled with all his strength. The hover engines fought against him, but Marcus didn't let go. His shoes scraped against the ground as he pulled the chair back to safety. A large truck passed by just seconds later, its wind making Marcus's school jacket flutter. The elderly woman was breathing hard, her hands shaking. Marcus helped her move the chair to a safe spot near a building wall. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked in his basic Korean. The woman nodded, still looking scared but relieved. She spoke to him in Korean, but Marcus could only understand a few words. She reached out and held his hand, saying thank you in English with a strong accent. People gathered around them, and someone called for help. A fancy black car appeared within minutes, and 2 men in suits rushed out. They spoke quickly to the woman and checked the wheelchair. One of them bowed deeply to Marcus and handed him a business card, but Marcus was already late for school. "I'm sorry, I have to go," Marcus said, bowing like he had learned to do. The woman called out something as he left, but he was already running to catch his bus. At school, Marcus couldn't focus on his lessons. He kept thinking about the woman and hoping she was okay. He didn't know that security cameras had recorded everything. He didn't know that the business card in his pocket belonged to Han Aerospace Technologies, one of the biggest companies in the world. And he had no idea that the woman he saved was Han Ji-ah, mother of the company's famous CEO. Most importantly, Marcus didn't know that this morning would change his life forever. As he sat in his classroom, studying Korean history, the video of his brave act was already reaching the desk of Do-Han Han, a man who would soon play a big role in Marcus's future. The hover wheelchair incident was just the beginning. In saving Mrs. Han's life, Marcus had opened a door to a world he never imagined he would be part of, a world of space travel, advanced technology, and corporate secrets. But for now, he was just a boy from Chicago, trying his best to understand his Korean teacher's words and thinking about what his grandmother would cook for dinner over their video call that evening. Do-Han Han sat in his office on the 200th floor of Han Aerospace Tower. The wall-sized windows showed the beautiful evening sky of Neo-Seoul, but he wasn't looking at the view. Instead, his eyes were fixed on the large screen before him, watching the security footage of his mother's accident for the 10th time. His hands tightened into fists as he watched the hover wheelchair malfunction. The sight of the young boy running to save his mother made his throat tight with emotion. Do-Han had spent billions of dollars on space technology, but he hadn't been able to make a safe wheelchair for his own mother. "Mr. Han," his assistant's voice came through the speaker. "Your mother is asking to see you." Do-Han stood up immediately. He straightened his suit and walked to the private elevator. As the elevator moved down to the medical floor, he thought about how little time he had spent with his mother lately. The company's big space project had taken all his attention. He found his mother in her room, looking out the window. The broken hover wheelchair sat in a corner, being examined by engineers. Mrs. Han turned when she heard him enter, and her face lit up with a smile. "Do-han," she said softly in Korean, "have you found the boy who helped me?" "We have his information from the school database," Do-han replied. "His name is Marcus Williams. He's an exchange student from Chicago." Mrs. Han nodded. "I want to meet him properly. He was very brave." She reached for her son's hand. "He reminded me of you when you were young, always trying to help others." Do-han felt guilty. When was the last time he had just sat and talked with his mother? The space colony project was important, but family should come first. He remembered how his mother had supported his dreams when he was young, even after her accident had left her partially paralyzed. "The wheelchair shouldn't have failed," he said, looking at the engineers. "We'll find out what went wrong." "Perhaps it's a sign," Mrs. Han said with a small smile. "A sign that you need to look closer to Earth sometimes, instead of always looking at the stars." Do-han thought about the boy in the video. Marcus Williams had acted without hesitation, without thinking about reward or recognition. In today's world of complex technology and business deals, such simple kindness was rare. "I've asked Song Myrae to look into his background," Do-han told his mother. "He's living with a host family here, maintains good grades, and works part-time at a local medical clinic. His grandmother raised him in Chicago." Mrs. Han's eyes sparkled with interest. Medical clinic. So young, and already interested in helping people. She touched her son's arm. "Do-han, I want you to offer him something. A chance, like the one your father gave you when you were young." Do-han understood what his mother meant. Years ago, when he was just a teenager with big dreams about space travel, his father had given him access to the company's labs. That opportunity had changed his life. Looking at the security footage one more time, Do-han made his decision. He would offer Marcus Williams an internship at Han Aerospace, not just as a thank you, but because he saw something special in the way the boy had acted. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries came from unexpected places. As he left his mother's room, Do-han instructed his assistant to prepare the internship documents. Tomorrow, Marcus Williams would receive an invitation that would change his life forever. But first, Do-han had another task. He would spend the evening with his mother, listening to her stories, just like he used to do when he was young. Marcus stood in the entrance hall of Han Aerospace Tower, feeling very small. The ceiling was so high, he had to bend his neck back to see it. Robots moved silently across the shiny floor, carrying messages and packages. His school uniform, which had seemed fine this morning, now felt wrinkled and plain. 2 days had passed since he had helped the elderly woman in the wheelchair. Now he understood who she was. Mrs. Han Ji-da, mother of the richest man in Korea. The invitation to visit Han Aerospace had arrived at his host family's house yesterday. A tall woman in a black suit approached him. "Marcus Williams," she asked with a kind smile. "I am Song Myrae, head of security. Please follow me." The elevator moved so fast Marcus's ears popped. When the doors opened, he saw a beautiful garden on the 150th floor. Real trees grew here, and a small stream flowed between them. Mrs. Han sat near the water, looking much better than the last time he had seen her. "Welcome, Marcus," she said in careful English. "Please, sit with me." Marcus sat on a bench near her wheelchair, a different one from before. Mrs. Han poured him tea from a traditional Korean tea set. "You have interested my son very much," she said. "He tells me you work at a medical clinic." Marcus nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I help clean and organize supplies. Sometimes I watch the doctors work. I want to be a doctor someday." Mrs. Han's eyes sparkled. A good dream. But perhaps an even bigger one is possible. She pressed a button on her wheelchair, and a large screen appeared in the air before them. It showed a huge spaceship being built. "This is the Morning Star," a deep voice said. Marcus turned to see Do-han walking toward them. The billionaire was younger than Marcus had expected, wearing a simple blue suit. Our first colonial ship, Doohan continued. It will carry 5,000 people to humanity's first space colony. But space is dangerous. We need good doctors up there. Marcus looked at the ship with wide eyes. He had read about the colony project in the news, but he had never imagined being this close to it. We would like to offer you an internship, Doohan said. You would learn about space medicine, help in our labs, and study with our best doctors. If you do well, there might be a place for you on that ship. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. His hand shook as he held his teacup. But I'm just in high school, he said. Mrs. Han touched his arm gently. Age does not matter. A good heart and a strong mind matter more. She smiled. Besides, I need someone to practice my English with, and I can teach you about traditional Korean medicine. The internship would be after school, Doohan explained. Your studies must come first. We have already spoken with your grandmother in Chicago. Marcus almost spilled his tea. You talked to my grandmother. Doohan smiled for the first time. She is a very wise woman. She said you have always reached for the stars. Now we are offering you a chance to actually reach them. Marcus looked at the spaceship again. He thought about his small room in Chicago, where he had put glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. He thought about his grandmother, who had worked 2 jobs to buy him science books. He thought about all the nights he had spent reading about space and dreaming of exploring it. When can I start? He asked. Mrs. Han clapped her hands happily. Tomorrow, she said, but first, you must have dinner with us. I want to hear all about Chicago. As Marcus sat with them, eating food he had never tried before and telling stories about his life, he realized something important. Sometimes the best families are the ones you find by accident. 3 months had passed since Marcus started his internship at Han Aerospace. He spent his afternoons learning about space medicine and his evenings studying traditional remedies with Mrs. Han. Today was different, though. Today was the first major test of the Morningstar's life support systems. Marcus stood in the observation room, watching through thick glass as engineers moved inside the ship. Doohan Han was there too, checking every system himself. The Morningstar sat in the massive testing chamber, its silver hull gleaming under the bright lights. All systems normal, the voice said over the speakers. Beginning artificial gravity test in 3 minutes. Mrs. Han sat next to Marcus in her new wheelchair, which worked much better than the old one. She had been teaching him about medicinal herbs, but now they both watched the test with excitement. Look at my son, she said softly. He has waited so long for this day. Marcus nodded. In the past months, he had learned that Doohan had spent 15 years planning this ship. The Morningstar wasn't just a spaceship, it was his dream of giving humanity a new home among the stars. 2 minutes until gravity test, the voice announced. Suddenly, Marcus noticed something strange on one of the monitoring screens. The bioneural system, which helped control the ship's functions, showed unusual patterns. They looked like the patterns he had studied in his medical training, when a patient's heart wasn't beating properly. 1 minute until gravity test. Marcus looked closer at the screen. The patterns were getting worse. He remembered what his grandmother always said, trust your instincts. Mrs. Han, he said quickly, something's wrong with the bioneural patterns. They look sick. Mrs. Han immediately pressed the emergency communication button on her wheelchair. Doohan, she called out, check the bioneural readings. But it was too late. The gravity system activated, and everything went wrong. Inside the ship, people began floating up as the artificial gravity reversed. Tools and equipment flew through the air. Doohan hit his head on a floating metal box. Emergency shutdown. Someone shouted, but the controls weren't responding. Marcus looked at the bioneural patterns again. In his hours of studying both space technology and traditional medicine, he had learned that sometimes the simplest solution was the best. The bioneural system was like a living thing, and right now, it was having something like a seizure. He ran to the main control panel. "We need to reset its rhythm," he shouted, like restarting a heart. The chief engineer looked at him in surprise, but Mrs. Hand spoke up. "Listen to him." Marcus's fingers flew over the controls, using what he had learned about both modern technology and traditional healing. He sent a carefully timed pulse through the bioneural system, like the beats of a steady heart. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the patterns on the screen began to stabilize. The artificial gravity slowly returned to normal. Inside the ship, people and objects gently floated back down. Medical teams rushed into the ship. They found Doohan conscious, but bleeding from a cut on his forehead. As they helped him out, he looked through the observation window at Marcus. "How did you know what to do?" he asked later, as a doctor cleaned his wound. "The bioneural system is partly alive," Marcus explained. "Mrs. Hand taught me that all living things have a natural rhythm. When that rhythm is disturbed, they get sick. They just need help finding their way back to it." Doohan looked at his mother, who smiled proudly. "It seems," he said, "that we have much to learn from both the future and the past." But even as they celebrated the crisis being over, none of them knew that this incident was no accident. Someone had tried to sabotage the Morning Star, and they would try again. The medical lab at Han Aerospace was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines. Marcus sat in a comfortable chair while doctors attached sensors to his head. A week had passed since the Morning Star incident, and the company wanted to understand exactly how he had saved the ship. "These readings are remarkable," Dr. Park said, looking at the screens. "Marcus, you have a very special brain." Doohan Hand stood nearby, his forehead now showing only a small bandage. "Explain it simply, doctor," he requested. Dr. Park pointed to the colorful patterns on the screen. "Marcus's brain can connect with bioneural systems in a way we've never seen before. Only 1 in a million people has this ability. When he looks at bioneural patterns, his brain naturally understands their rhythm." Marcus touched one of the sensors on his head. "Is that why I could feel that something was wrong with the Morning Star?" "Exactly," Dr. Park said. "You didn't just see the problem. You felt it. Your brain can communicate with bioneural systems like they're part of your own body." Mrs. Han, who had insisted on being present, smiled proudly. "I knew he was special from the day he saved me," she said. "Some people have a gift for healing, whether it's bodies or machines." Just then, Song Mai Ray entered the lab quickly. She whispered something to Doohan, whose face became serious. "Show me," he said. Mai Ray activated a large screen on the wall. It showed a news report about Han Aerospace. A woman named Na Subin, the CEO of rival company Suntech, was speaking to reporters. "The incident at Han Aerospace raises serious safety concerns," Na Subin said. "Can we trust them with the lives of 5,000 colonists when they can't even run a simple test safely?" Doohan turned off the screen. "Suntech has been trying to start their own space colony project for years," he explained to Marcus. "They would be happy to see us fail." "But we didn't fail," Marcus said. "We solved the problem." "Yes, thanks to you." Doohan looked thoughtful. "But we can't announce your ability to the world. Some people would try to use it for the wrong reasons." Mrs. Han moved her wheelchair closer to Marcus. "Remember what I taught you about healing energy. In the wrong hands, even medicine can become poison." Marcus understood. His ability to connect with bioneural systems could be very valuable and dangerous in the wrong hands. He remembered how his grandmother always told him to be careful who he trusted. "There's something else," Mayray said. She showed them another screen, displaying security camera footage from inside the Morning Star during the test. "Look at this part of the ship's programming. The gravity malfunction wasn't an accident. Someone changed the code on purpose." The room went quiet. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Someone had tried to make the test fail. Someone wanted to stop the Morning Star from reaching space. "Who would do this?" he asked. Doohan's face was grim. "That's what we need to find out." But for now, Marcus, you need to be careful. You're not just an intern anymore. You're one of the most important people in this project. As Marcus left the lab that evening, he felt different. His special ability made him valuable, but it also put him in danger. He looked up at the huge shape of the morning star through the testing chamber windows. Somewhere in Han Aerospace, someone was working against them. Someone wanted to destroy Duhan's dream of reaching the stars. But Marcus wasn't afraid. With his new family at Han Aerospace supporting him, he was ready to face whatever challenges came next. Marcus sat in Song Mei-rei's security office, looking at screens that covered the walls. Each screen showed a different part of Han Aerospace Tower. It was late evening, and most employees had gone home. Marcus should have been home too, but he and Mei-rei had discovered something important. "Watch this camera feed again," Mei-rei said, pointing to one screen. The video showed someone entering the Morning Star's control room at night, 3 days before the accident. The person wore a maintenance uniform and kept their face away from the cameras. "They knew where the cameras were," Marcus said. "They knew the building's security system." Mei-rei nodded. This person had high-level access. They could enter restricted areas without setting off any alarms. Just then, Du-han entered the office. He looked tired. The company's stock price had fallen after No Soo-bin's news interview, and many investors were worried about the colonial project. "What have you found?" he asked. Mei-rei showed him the security footage. "The saboteur must be someone inside Han Aerospace, someone who knows our systems very well." Du-han's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and his face became pale. "My mother's wheelchair just lost power," he said. "All safety systems are offline." Marcus jumped up. "Which floor is she on?" "The garden level. But the elevators have stopped working too." Marcus remembered something Mrs. Han had taught him about the building's systems. Like the Morning Star, Han Aerospace Tower used bioneural technology. "I can help," he said. "The building's main control room is 1 floor below us." They ran to the control room. Inside, all the screens showed error messages. Marcus sat at the main console and placed his hands on the control panel. He closed his eyes, feeling the building's rhythms like Mrs. Han had taught him to feel the energy in traditional medicine. "The system isn't broken," he said after a moment. "Someone changed its programming, just like on the Morning Star. But they made a mistake this time." His fingers moved across the controls. In his mind, he could feel the building's bioneural network like a living thing. He found the wrong pattern and began to fix it. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. On a screen, they saw Na Soo-bin walking into the garden level. She moved toward Mrs. Han, who sat in her powerless wheelchair near the stream. "It was a trap," Mei-rei said. "They wanted to get us away from Mrs. Han." But Marcus was still connected to the building's systems. He felt something else. Another person accessing the controls from somewhere in the tower. Someone was helping Na Soo-bin. Someone close to the Han family. "Du-han," he said. "Check who else is in the building right now. Someone from your family is still here." Du-han checked the employee logs. His face showed shock when he saw the name. "It's impossible," he whispered. On the screen, they watched as Na Soo-bin reached Mrs. Han. But Mrs. Han didn't look scared. Instead, she smiled and pressed a hidden button on her wheelchair. Suddenly, security robots appeared from behind the trees, surrounding Na Soo-bin. "My mother knew," Du-han said with pride. She was ready for them. But their relief didn't last long. They still had to find the person inside Han Aerospace who had helped Na Soo-bin. And when they did, Du-han would face the hardest choice of his life. The morning sun shone through the windows of Han Aerospace Tower. Security robots led Na Soo-bin away in special handcuffs, while police officers took statements from witnesses. But Marcus noticed that Du-han wasn't watching any of this. Instead, he stared at a photograph on his desk, showing his family from years ago. "Your cousin," Marcus said quietly. "It was your cousin who helped her." Du-han nodded slowly. The employee logs had revealed that his cousin, Han Tae-young, was the one who had changed the building systems. Tae-young had always been jealous that Do-han's father had chosen Do-han to lead the company instead of him. "He thought I was weak," Do-han said. "He said I spent too much time taking care of my mother instead of focusing on the company. He wanted Na Soo-bin to show everyone I couldn't handle the colonial project." Mrs. Han wheeled herself into the office. Her wheelchair worked perfectly now, after Marcus had fixed the building systems. "Family should help each other, not hurt each other," she said sadly. Song Mei-rae entered with more news. "The police have arrested Ta-young," she reported. "They found evidence that he and Na Soo-bin planned everything together. They wanted the colonial project to fail so Suntech could take over." Marcus thought about everything that had happened since that morning when he saved Mrs. Han from her malfunctioning wheelchair. In just a few months, his life had changed completely. Now he understood biomural systems better than anyone, and he had helped save both Mrs. Han and the Morning Star. "Marcus," Do-han said, "the colonial ship launches in 1 month. We want you to come with us as our junior medical officer. Your ability to work with bioneural systems could save many lives in space." Marcus's heart beat faster. This was his dream. A chance to explore space, to help people, to be part of humanity's greatest adventure. But then he thought about his grandmother in Chicago, and his original plan to return home after his year as an exchange student. "I know it's a big decision," Mrs. Han said gently. "The colony will need both modern medicine and traditional healing. I can teach you more, and you can help design better medical systems for the colonists." Marcus looked out the window at the Morning Star, its silver hull gleaming in the sunrise. The ship would carry 5,000 people to a new home among the stars. They would need someone who understood both the human body and the ship's bioneural systems. His grandmother's words came back to him. "Sometimes the biggest dreams are the scariest, but that's how you know they're worth following." He thought about his small room in Chicago and the toy rocket ships he used to play with. He thought about all the nights he had spent reading about space medicine, never believing he would have a real chance to practice it. But he also thought about his grandmother, who had raised him alone, who had worked so hard to give him opportunities. Could he leave her behind? As if reading his thoughts, Do-han spoke again. "Your grandmother wouldn't have to stay in Chicago," he said. "We have already invited her to move to Neo-Seoul. She could work with our medical research team, sharing her experience with younger doctors." Marcus looked at Mrs. Han, who had become like a second grandmother to him. He looked at Do-han, who had given him a chance when others might not have. He thought about all the people on the colony ship who might need his special abilities one day. The choice was difficult, but in his heart, Marcus knew what he had to do. 1 month later, Marcus stood in the Morning Star's medical bay, arranging his equipment. The colony ship would launch tomorrow, carrying 5,000 people to their new home among the stars. Through the window, he could see Earth shining blue and beautiful below the space station. The medical bay looked different now. Marcus had helped design it, combining modern technology with traditional healing methods he had learned from Mrs. Han. Plants with healing properties grew in special containers along the walls. Biomural sensors that could understand a patient's condition better than any normal machine lined the beds. "Everything ready?" a familiar voice asked. Marcus turned to see his grandmother entering the medical bay. She wore the uniform of Han Aerospace's medical research team, looking professional and proud. She had moved to Neo-Seoul 2 weeks ago and already loved her new job teaching young doctors about practical medicine. "Almost ready, Grandma," Marcus replied. "I still can't believe we're both here." "I can believe it," she said, hugging him. "You've always been special, Marcus. You just needed the right people to see it too." The door opened again, and Mrs. Han came in, her wheelchair moving smoothly. The chair now used the same biomural technology that Marcus had helped develop. It could respond to her thoughts and never malfunctioned like the old one had. "My 2 favorite medical experts," Mrs. Han said warmly. She had been teaching Marcus's grandmother about Korean traditional medicine, while his grandmother shared her knowledge of community healthcare. Together, they had created new ways of treating patients that worked better than either method alone. Doohan arrived next, carrying a small box. "A gift for our youngest medical officer," he said, handing it to Marcus. Inside the box was a special badge. It showed the Morning Star's symbol, but it was different from the regular crew badges. This one had a green medical cross and was marked Chief of Bioneural Medicine. "You created this position," Marcus said, surprised. Doohan smiled. "We created it because we needed it. You understand the connection between human health and bioneural systems better than anyone. The colonists will need that knowledge." Suddenly, the ship's speakers came alive. "Attention all crew. Launch sequence begins in 12 hours. Please complete final preparations." Marcus's grandmother touched the badge on his uniform. "Your parents would be so proud," she said softly. "Just like I am." Mrs. Han reached for Marcus's hand. "Remember everything I taught you about healing energy. The body and mind are connected, just like the ship's systems are connected. Never forget to treat both." "I won't forget," Marcus promised. He looked at these three people who had changed his life so much. His grandmother, who had always believed in him, Mrs. Han, who had taught him to see healing in a new way, and Doohan, who had given him the chance to reach for the stars. The next day, as the Morning Star lifted off from Earth, Marcus stood at the medical bay window with his grandmother and the Hans. They watched their home planet grow smaller below them. But Marcus wasn't leaving everything behind. He was taking the most important things with him. Family, both old and new. Knowledge, both modern and traditional. And the understanding that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single act of kindness. As the ship entered deep space, Marcus smiled. That morning when he saved Mrs. Han's wheelchair seemed like a lifetime ago. He hadn't known then that he was also saving his own future, opening a door to adventures he had only dreamed about. Now, as humanity's first colony ship carried them all toward a new home, he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead.